My name is Olivia, though most people who know me just call me Liv, and this is the story of how I learned that silence can be louder than any confrontation, that patience can be a weapon sharper than anger, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do as a woman in your 40s is simply walk away. The thing nobody tells you about standing up for yourself is that it rarely looks like what you see in the movies. There's no dramatic confrontation in a public place. There's no moment where everyone gasps and realizes you were right all along. Instead, there's just the quiet arithmetic of consequences, the slow math of cause and effect, and the private knowledge that you made a choice that nobody expected you to make. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe to Olive Revenge Stories, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. It was December 23rd, a cold Tuesday evening, when the world outside my childhood home looked like something from a Hallmark movie nobody asked for. The kind of Christmas that gets suffocating when you're past a certain age, when decorations that seemed magical at 10 start feeling like props in someone else's production. I was home for exactly 4 days, something my mother had reminded me of at least 6 times before I even arrived, as if I might forget that I'd cleared my schedule specifically for this obligation. The house on Whitmore Lane hadn't changed in 15 years. The same cream-colored shutters, the same oak trees in the front yard, the same heavy silence that settled over everything after dark, like the house itself was holding its breath. My father was somewhere in the kitchen watching football with the volume turned too loud, a fixture so permanent it barely counted as a person anymore. My mother was in her element, orchestrating the dinner with the precision of someone commanding a military operation. And my brother Derek, well, Derek was where Derek always was, leaning against the counter talking about his plans while someone else did the work. I'd grown comfortable with this role by my 40s. I was the successful one, the one who'd made something of herself, who'd built a career in commercial real estate that had taken her from a middle-class family in Ohio to a woman who could afford a $350,000 condo in a revitalized neighborhood just outside Columbus. I was the one people looked at with a certain confused respect, like I'd somehow violated the rules of my family's narrative by refusing to play the parts assigned to me. No husband, no children, no apologies for either choice. Just a life that was mine, quietly and completely mine, and a home that had cost me 7 years of 80-hour work weeks and the kind of focus that made people uncomfortable when they tried to relate to it. The condo was my pride in a way that was probably unhealthy. My therapist, yes, I have a therapist, another thing my mother considers a personality flaw, said it represented independence and autonomy. I said it represented the fact that I'd survived my childhood and come out the other side knowing how to make something beautiful from something broken. The place had been abandoned for 3 years when I bought it, a foreclosure property that everyone else in my firm said was too risky, too far gone, too expensive to renovate properly. I saw potential. I saw hardwood floors under the cheap linoleum. I saw crown molding hidden beneath decades of water damage. I saw a future where I could point to something concrete and say, this is what I built. It took me 3 years to fully restore it. I was there on weekends with contractors and tile samples, pulling out old carpet and discovering original wood beneath. I was there at midnight on closing day with a bottle of champagne nobody was around to share, standing in the middle of my living room and crying in a way I rarely allowed myself to do. That condo wasn't just property. It was proof. Proof that I could survive on my own. Proof that I didn't need anyone's permission to build something beautiful. Proof that the girl from the middle-class family with the favored brother and the disappointed parents could become someone who mattered in her own right. The thing about having a favored sibling is that it rewires something fundamental in your understanding of how family works. You learn early that love isn't distributed equally, that some people get second chances, and some people are expected to get it right the first time. Derek had been struggling with money for as long as I could remember. Derek had business ideas that never quite worked out. Derek had reasons why he couldn't quite get ahead. And somehow, across all those years, I'd become the person who helped him anyway. Not because I was generous or kind, though I'd told myself that story for a long time. I helped him because guilt is a powerful currency, and my family had been paying me in guilt my entire life. Every time I succeeded at something Derek couldn't quite manage, I got a lecture about humility. Every time I bought something nice, I got asked if I really needed it when Derek's kids needed school supplies. Every time I took a vacation, I had to hear about how Derek was struggling to keep up with his mortgage. I'd paid for Derek's college education. I'd paid for Derek's wedding. I'd paid for Derek's business startup. Something I'd done against every instinct I had. Something I'd done because my mother had cried on the phone and told me I'd regret it if Derek's dreams died because of my selfishness. Derek's dreams died anyway, and I learned that money couldn't buy you a different family, though God knows I'd tried. So by the time I was 43, I'd built a kind of careful distance from all of it. I was present but not too present. I returned calls but didn't initiate them. I attended family dinners but didn't allow myself to care too much about the outcome of any of them. It was a survival strategy that looked like apathy from the outside and felt like sanity from the inside. I'd learned to separate myself from their expectations the way you separate yolk from white, carefully and completely. That December night, I was in the guest room, my childhood bedroom, actually, though my mother had redecorated it 3 times since I'd left and somehow made it feel like a room that belonged to a stranger. When I heard them, the house was old, which meant voices carried through the walls like the building itself was trying to tell you secrets. My mother's voice first, that particular tone she used when she was being strategic, when she was making the kind of plans that required other people not to know about them. Derek's voice next, lower, more uncertain, the way he always sounded when he was asking permission for something he knew he shouldn't have. I wasn't trying to listen. The bathroom was between my room and the hallway, and I was walking past their bedroom when the words became clear enough that pretending I couldn't hear them became impossible. They were talking about my condo. They were talking about Derek moving in. They were talking about timing it for when I'd be in Singapore on business, for when I wouldn't be around to object or complicate things. I heard my mother say something about how it was family property anyway, that I'd been too private about it for too long, that Derek's kids needed stability, and I had more space than I could possibly use by myself. I heard Derek say something about how temporary it would be, just until they got back on their feet, just until they figured things out. I heard my father's voice in the background, quieter, something about legal issues, and my mother's response, sharp and dismissive, something about me not being difficult, about how I'd always been reasonable when they explained things properly. I stood there in the hallway of the house I'd grown up in, listening to people I'd known my entire life discuss the theft of something that was entirely mine, and something very strange happened. I didn't get angry. I didn't cry. I didn't feel betrayed in the way I'd felt betrayed 1,000 times before over smaller things. Instead, I felt something cold and clear settle into my mind, the way water turns to ice on a winter night. It was decision-making time. It was consequences time. It was the moment when my entire relationship to my family shifted on its axis, and I finally understood something my therapist had been trying to tell me for years, that setting boundaries isn't an act of cruelty, it's an act of self-defense. I stood in the hallway for maybe 30 seconds, just breathing, letting the full dimensions of the situation settle into my consciousness. Then I went back to my room and got into bed and didn't sleep for the entire night, but I wasn't worried or upset. I was planning. I was thinking 3 moves ahead, like I was playing chess against people who didn't even understand they were in the game. The next morning, I came downstairs and smiled at my mother and told her the condo listing agent had called about a potential buyer and that I might be flying back to Columbus early to handle paperwork. I watched her face and saw the moment of alarm cross it, the moment she realized the timeline might be tighter than she'd expected. I watched Derek lean forward and ask me about it, his voice casual, and I told him it was probably nothing, that these deals always fell through, that I'd let them know if anything changed. I was lying. The condo listing agent hadn't called. There was no buyer. I was going to make sure there was one. I drove back to Columbus on December 24th, told my family I was sorry, but the potential buyer was flying in and I needed to meet with them and handle some documentation, left them with a promise that I'd be back to celebrate New Year's with them, and I meant absolutely none of it. What I meant was that I was going to save myself, and I was going to do it without drama or confrontation or any of the explanations they were expecting. I called my real estate lawyer, a woman named Catherine who'd handled the closing on my condo and who'd become something like a friend through the process. I told her I wanted to list the property. I told her I wanted to move fast. I told her I was willing to price it aggressively if it meant getting it sold before New Year's. Catherine, who was nobody's fool and who'd heard enough stories from enough people to understand what was probably happening, asked me a single question. Did I want to do this quietly, or did I want to do it loudly? I told her quietly. I told her I wanted paperwork filed and locked in place before anyone in my family could do anything to complicate the situation. I listed the condo on December 27th. I priced it at $325,000, which was below market value, but not so dramatically below it that it would seem suspicious. I made the listing photos available digitally, no open houses, no showing times that anyone could predict. I was selling something beautiful and urgent and slightly underpriced, which meant it was going to move fast. Catherine put the word out to other real estate agents in her network. By December 29th, I had 3 serious offers. By December 30th, I had a signed contract with a contingency period of only 4 days. My family still didn't know. They were at home planning a New Year's Eve party, probably, or discussing the move-in timeline, or making plans that were already obsolete. I was in my condo, standing in the middle of the living room that had been my sanctuary for so many years, documenting everything with photographs and video, because I knew that before this was over, there would be questions about what had been there and what hadn't, about damage and care, and the kind of details that matter in evictions. The closing was set for January 6th. I was getting calls from my mother by then, casual calls about when I was coming back, whether I'd changed my plans, whether I was being weird about something. I told her I was buried in work, that I'd be back after the closing, that everything was fine. Everything was fine. Everything was completely under control. I went back to my apartment, the one I kept in Columbus for when work required it, and I watched my phone with the way you watch something you've been waiting for your entire life. On January 5th, Derek called me. His voice was different, high and strained, like something inside him had started to panic. He told me he needed to talk to me about something important, that they'd decided to move some things into the condo to store them, that it would only be temporary, that they wanted my permission. I told him that was interesting because I just closed the sale of the condo that morning and the new owners were taking possession that afternoon. I told him gently, which somehow made it worse. There was this silence on the other end of the line, this vacuum of sound where understanding was supposed to happen but hadn't yet. Then Derek asked me if I was serious. I told him I'd never been more serious about anything in my life. He told me I was being cruel. I told him I was being safe. He told me they were family. I told him family doesn't make plans to steal your home while you're overseas. He hung up. The calls started after that. 78 of them over the course of a week. My mother called first, then my father, then Derek, then my mother again, then relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, people who'd gotten the news and decided they needed to weigh in on what I'd done. Everyone had a different angle. Everyone had a different lecture prepared. My mother told me I was being selfish and cruel, and that I was destroying the family over something that didn't matter. My father told me there were legal implications, and that I needed to think about what I'd done. Derek told me that my sister-in-law was devastated and that their children were asking why their aunt hated them. Extended family members told me I was being too hard, that family was supposed to help each other, that I'd changed and become someone they didn't recognize. I didn't answer any of the calls. I didn't call back. I didn't explain or justify or defend myself. I simply turned off my notifications and let my phone fill up with voicemails the way you let a mailbox overflow with mail you're not interested in reading. The silence was peaceful in a way I hadn't anticipated. There's something deeply satisfying about making a decision and then refusing to defend it. It removes the conversation from the realm of debate and puts it in the realm of fact. The condo had been sold. The new owners were moving in. There was nothing to discuss. The papers had been signed. The numbers had been transferred. The thing was done. By January 15th, when my mother finally reached me because I had to answer eventually because she used the trick where she called from an unknown number and claimed it was an emergency, she sounded different. She sounded small. She told me they were working with a lawyer, that Derek was looking into what options he had, that they wanted to understand my reasoning. I told her my reasoning was that they'd planned to commit what amounts to property fraud, that they'd timed it for when I was out of the country specifically so I couldn't object, that they'd assumed I wouldn't discover what they'd done until they were already established in my home. I told her that in the state of Ohio, what they were planning constitutes residential fraud and elder exploitation if they'd falsified documents to establish residency, which I was fairly certain they had been planning to do. I told her, very calmly, that I'd chosen to sell the property rather than pursue criminal charges. I told her that as a gift to the family I'd built my entire life trying to please, I was offering them the mercy of not destroying Derek's life with a felony conviction. Then I hung up. I didn't block her number. I didn't cut off contact completely. I simply established a new normal where the boundaries were visible and firm and non-negotiable. I took calls only when I wanted to take them. I answered questions only about topics I was willing to discuss. I sent one holiday card the following Christmas, a nice one, with my address listed on it and an implicit message that if they wanted to re-establish a relationship with me, it would be on terms that I set. Most of them didn't try. Derek didn't try. He couldn't afford a lawyer to contest anything, and the new homeowners were already settled in and making renovations. My mother tried, sporadically, to re-establish communication, but she was always looking for me to apologize, for me to acknowledge that I'd been too harsh, too unforgiving, too willing to destroy family relationships over money. I never did apologize. I never did acknowledge any of that. Instead, I built a better life, one that was more intentionally chosen, more carefully curated, more completely mine. The condo sale had happened almost 5 years ago now. I don't live in Columbus anymore. I moved to Denver and then to Austin, taking jobs that interest me and building a career that belongs entirely to myself. I don't speak to my parents very often. We exchange birthday greetings and Christmas cards like two people who went to high school together and feel obligated to acknowledge that shared history. Derek is doing better, I've heard through the grapevine. His marriage survived, though apparently they're living in a smaller house now, and he's working somewhere in logistics. I don't feel guilty about any of that. I learned something important from the whole situation. Guilt is a tool used to keep you small, to keep you manageable, to keep you believing that other people's irresponsibility is somehow your obligation. Once you understand that, once you really and truly see it clearly, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to being the version of yourself that apologizes for things that aren't your fault. You can't go back to being the person who takes responsibility for other people's choices. What I did to my family was withdraw my participation in their dysfunction. I stopped being the person who paid for things. I stopped being the person who enabled their poor decisions. I stopped being the person who carried guilt for things that were not my responsibility. Some people call that revenge. Some people call that cruel. But I call it what it actually was. The moment I decided my own life was worth protecting more than my family's comfort. The most interesting part of the story, the part that people always ask me about when I tell the story in person, is not whether I regret what I did. I don't, and I never will. The most interesting part is that my family tried to reframe the narrative once they realized they couldn't control the outcome. They told people that I'd done something unreasonable, that I'd been waiting for an excuse to cut them off, that there was more to the story than I was telling. They tried to make themselves the victims of my cruelty instead of the perpetrators of their own fraud. And you know what I realized in watching them do that? I realized that they were still trying to manage my story, still trying to convince other people that their version was the real one, still trying to make themselves look reasonable in comparison to me. I realized that the only way to really win against people like that is to refuse to participate in the conversation they're trying to have with you. The only way to really protect yourself is to build a life that doesn't require their validation or their understanding. So that's what I did. I built a life where I don't have to explain myself to people who've already decided I'm wrong. I built a life where my worth isn't measured by my willingness to sacrifice. I built a life where family is something I choose, not something I endure. And that, more than any legal victory, more than any eviction notice, more than the sale of a property that was supposed to be stolen from me, that is the real revenge. The real victory isn't that I sold the condo and made $80,000 instead of $350,000. The real victory is that I looked my family's entitlement in the face and said no, and then I had the strength to mean it. The real victory is that I chose myself. The real victory is that I'm still here, still thriving, still building something beautiful, and I'm doing it all on my own terms. The real victory is that I don't need them to understand what I did or why I did it. Their understanding stopped being important to me the night I stood in that hallway and heard them plan to steal from me. Their approval stopped mattering the moment I realized that I'd been sacrificing my own peace to maintain their comfort. And that freedom, that clarity, that ability to walk away from people who don't have your best interests at heart, that's worth more than any property, any amount of money, any amount of family loyalty that was never reciprocated in the first place. What would you have done in my position? Was this revenge, or was this self-preservation? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and I think your perspective matters. Your story matters. The experiences you've had, the boundaries you've set, the people you've had to walk away from, those matter too. If you found something in my story that resonated with your own life, if you've ever had to choose yourself over family loyalty, if you've ever wondered whether it was wrong to protect yourself, then I want you to know that you're not alone. I want you to know that your choice to take care of yourself isn't selfish. I want you to know that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop explaining yourself to people who've decided not to listen. If you thought my story was unbelievable, wait until you hear what happened when my cousin found out her mother-in-law had forged her name on a will and tried to inherit her entire life insurance policy. Spoiler alert, it didn't end the way the mother-in-law expected. Subscribe to Olive Revenge Stories so you never miss these stories of people who chose themselves, people who set boundaries, people who refused to be exploited by the family members they were supposed to love unconditionally. These are the stories that don't get told in family gatherings. These are the stories that don't make it to holiday dinners. These are the stories of women and men who learned that love and protection are not the same thing, that obligation and genuine connection are worlds apart, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is let people go. Let's keep breathing life into these stories together. Let's keep reminding each other that we deserve better. Subscribe now, and let's change the narrative about what family is supposed to be.